Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Collison. I'm here with Dean Jones, and we want to welcome you to this LinkedIn Live. If you're joining us, we'd love to have your top five in chat. That's kind of what we do here. And so jump over to the comments, put your top five in there, and we will be displaying those as we go along. So don't stop doing that. Like I mentioned before, I'm here with Dean Jones. Dean is the Global Talent Development Architect here and a senior learning expert at Gallup. He's also the chair of our Diversity Council. And Dean, great to have you on this LinkedIn Live. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, Dean, that title sounds super important, but what does that really mean from a day-to-day responsibilities, and what do you do for Gallup?
Really my job is I spend every day thinking about how do people learn and grow? How do people, one of the things for me, I would say through my whole life is I've just been really fascinated by how do people develop and how do you have a life where you're learning and growing all the time, you're developing yourself all the time. So, and that's what I get paid to do at Gallup. And I think about all of our associates around the world and think about how they're growing and how they're developing and what they need and what's next for them.
I always appreciate that. You're a partner with me with our certified coaching community. You spend 6 or 8 times a year podcasting with me on Called to Coach about
Yeah.
that. And I just love the fact that you just really care about them and that you really care about their development. It really shines through on our Called to Coach podcast. So thanks for doing that, Dean. Always great to have you on those as well.
Yeah.
Today we're talking about how to use your strengths to lead through change and uncertainty. Not that we've had any of that in the last couple years, probably not a
Really.
very hot topic, but Dean, give us a little intro when we say lead through change and what do we really mean by that? Give us a little bit of an intro on that.
Oh, I just think that right now, I mean, we're living through a period where there's sort of unprecedented change, right? I mean, we all talk about the pandemic and what an abrupt and change that was, and how dislocating that is. But I think we're also living through all then the impacts that have kind of rolled out of that. So the way that work is changing in our society, and where people are located for work, and the kind of jobs that people have, and the kind of work people do. I just think that's all changing at a really big pace. The other thing is all the kind of social impacts that has for all of us, right? And so I think we're living this time of just tremendous change. And I know that there's people out there that say, "Oh man, I love change. I think change is great." I think So one of the things I always say is the people that tell you that they love change, what they mean is they love change when they can see it coming and they can control it, right? I think the kind of change that, people don't see coming and that feels like they're just at the effect of it, that's change that's really hard for people. And it can be really emotional and really dislocating for people. So,
Dean, I manage a community of about 14,000 certified coaches, and I manage them through three
yes, you
years
do.
of change. And not everybody liked all the things, right? I mean, I heard that from from the tip of the spear. We want to encourage you, if you're just joining us, drop your top five in chat. We'll be taking your questions live. So if you have those, you can throw those in the chat as well. We'd love to see them. And thanks for joining us. Dean, you mentioned, most people like to control the change that happens. So
Yeah.
most of us probably resist change. Why do we do that? I mean, what is this? What is it about it that causes us to resist change?
Yeah, it's great. Great question. I think there's a lot of reasons, and there's some common reasons. By the way, if you're interested in this, I think there's a great article on in the Harvard Business Review by Rosabeth Moss Cantor on this. She talks about like some of the common reasons that people resist change, and I think she's captured some of the ones that I think come up not only organizationally, change inside of organizations, change inside of companies, but some of the stuff that comes up personally. When people are dealing with things like divorce or job loss or big change in job responsibilities or, that kind of thing, right? Health issues. One is that a big part of change that's hard for people is when change is sudden and when it feels like it surprises us and there's no time to react. When people have that sense that, hey, this change is happening to me and I don't really have a say in it, that's really hard for people, right? The level of uncertainty goes up in times of change. It's like, hey, and I think we all are comfortable dealing with a certain level of uncertainty, some more than less, right? But and for some of us, we thrive a little bit on that uncertainty, right? But there's kind of, this is going to sound like a funny thing to say, but there's predictable uncertainty, right? Hey, if I'm an EMT and I go to work, I'm probably going to get called to a few things. And, that kind of variety is going to be interesting for me. There's also the uncertainty that's greater than normal. And in times of change, that level of uncertainty goes up. And I think that's really hard for people. I also think sometimes, by the way, when people say, hey, I like change, what they mean is I like variety, not necessarily change, right? It's
Mhm.
like, hey,
Mhm.
I'm interested in some variety in this, not just wholesale change, right?
Dean, would that be predictable reliability? In other words, there might be
Yeah,
15 different things that can happen, but
yeah,
I know of them. They're not
yeah.
gonna catch me off guard, right?
Yeah, I mean, to use
Yeah.
the EMT analogy, if I'm an EMT and I know I'm going to go to work, I may not know what's going to happen that day, but I've trained for all of it, right? So I'm trained to do that. So there's some variety in what I'm doing, but I'm set up for that variety, right? Part of what's hard about change is that it can be really uncomfortable. All of a sudden, everything's different. It feels uncomfortable. I'm out of my routine, right? That's hard. Some of the things that people deal with in change, and this is the part I think where strengths really makes a difference, is for people is some of the emotional parts of it, where I feel like, hey, change is happening, and I'm worried I'm not going to be up for it. I'm worried that in some ways I might be embarrassed as part of it, right? It might be stuff where, hey, everything that I was doing before, they're going to tell me was wrong. Oh, that was all the bad stuff. Oh, we don't want to do the bad stuff anymore,
Or
right?
I believed in what was gonna be wrong. I was anticipating, I
Yeah,
was trying to predict, and I was wrong in that.
yeah,
Yeah,
that's right. That's
yeah.
right. There's also stuff, you see this in organizations a lot where people say, hey, we're going to make a change. And I was the one owning the old system. So, hey, does that mean everything I was doing was the bad stuff and now we're going to fix it? Right. And it's very common. You see new leaders come in or new managers come in, and they sort of, in order to establish themselves, they sort of invalidate what happened before. But that can be really hard for people that were invested in what happened before,
Mhm.
whether it was the prior manager or leader or was it the team, right? So there's also this sense of competence that kind of is like, hey, can I do this? Am I going to be able to roll with this? We're at Gallup. Jim, you know this, but we're implementing a new ERP system at Gallup, a new enterprise resource planning system. And like I've spent the last 2 weeks in training with basically every single one of our associates, right? Every one of our employees around the world, and the question is always in the background. Hey, am I going to be able to master this? Hey, what is this going to mean? Am I going to be able to stay on top of this thing? So, my point is that change can be a real threat for people. It's also incredibly dislocating for people, and it's the things that you deal with when you deal with change are, hey, helping people to be able to anticipate change, to be able to see it coming, helping people with that sense of control, right? I know that this is happening. I may or may not have a say in whether this is happening, but how can I manage my way through it so that I still have that sense of control, right? And then change also, I think, for people that are going through this kind of change, there's that loss of my sense of myself, right? Sometimes in the middle of that change, we're so engaged in what's going to happen and what I'm going to need to do and like that we forget kind of who we are. Who am I? What do I do? What do I contribute? What do I do best? Who am I? We kind of it's easy sometimes in the face of change to lose sight of all that, right? And that's where I think sometimes strengths is a great resource, is it gives us back our sense of ourselves, right? And who we are and what we do best and what we contribute and why we're there in the first place.
We're talking about leading through change and using your strengths as we're talking about leading through change. If you have questions, we'd love to have you throw those in the chat. We'll be answering those live. Dean, how much of in being a leader, how
Yeah.
much of that responsibility is anticipating that change that's coming? We often think of change as in the moment. I get word that this is going to be different. But
Yeah.
as leaders, what's our responsibility to try and look ahead to maybe soften the blow or to anticipate that change coming with those that we're leading?
Yeah. Great question, Jim. It's so one of the things we've talked about for years are something we call the 7 demands of leadership. right? So what are those demands that we know that are the kind of those key qualities that we know leaders need to have in order to serve the people that they're leading, right? One of those is we talk about is called making sense of experience. So are you somebody as a leader that can kind of scan the world out there, know what's happening, know what's coming? And part of your job as a leader is to kind of make sense of that for the people that you lead, to be able to say, hey, this is how I see the world. This is how I see our work. This is the, and part of that is connecting it to the mission, but part of it is helping people to anticipate, hey, what's coming. Sometimes, you see leaders that are very, very good at that and help kind of shape that for people in a way that's really powerful. So people feel equipped and empowered and have that sense of, hey, I can kind of anticipate what's going. Sometimes there are changes that happen abruptly that you didn't see coming, and as a leader, it's hard. And part of your job is to deal with the ripple effect or the repercussions of, hey, we didn't see this coming, but our job's to handle it now, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I always think for leaders, there's really three kind of responsibilities, right? Around change. One is anticipation, as much as possible, helping people to see it coming. Part of it is communication. Hey, am I helping people understand the change? During times of change, and you'll see this, there's about 1 million different experts who have their principles of change management, right? But almost the one thread through all of them is, hey, through change, we got to over communicate. We got to communicate as much as possible. I was laughing because somebody asked me this week, as we've been going through this systems change, hey, are we communicating too much? I'm like, there's no such thing. No such thing as communicating too much, particularly in a time of change. Right. So, there's got to be a lot of transparency. There's got to be a lot of communication because you're helping people process change, and people are going to process it at different rates. And they need time to be able to understand that and manage it. I do say to people sometimes that if people understood something or learned something the first time I said it to them, I wouldn't have a job. Right?
Exactly.
You
Exactly right.
We got to hear it a few times, right?
Yeah.
So part of it is saying it over and over. The third thing is really, and this is, I think, one of the best things leaders can give people is that sense of autonomy and competence and control. Right? So anticipation, communication, control, those are the three things that I think leaders can do as they move through a time of change. And part of it is giving people that sense of autonomy, that sense of control. I think when you help people get grounded again in their strengths and their talents, that helps people to regain that sense of control or that sense of certainty around things. So I think that's one of the most powerful things leaders can do,
That's great. Eduardo asked a great question that sets us up. We haven't mentioned strengths yet, and people are like, hey, what about strengths? So Eduardo says, hey, Dean, are there any potential reports like the sales leaders or manager report or research articles with suggestions for how to use specific talent themes to support personal change and or help clients with change resistance? Any thoughts on that, Dean?
I think, I'm going to say something that's going to seem a little basic. No, do we have a specific report where there's like the change report? No, we don't have the change report, right? But one of the things I think, if you're somebody that works with people inside of their strengths, whether you're a manager, whether you're a coach, I think it's really looking at people's the regular CliftonStrengths 34 report through that lens of change, right? One of the things we know just kind of basically, right? So if we just start from the basics here, we know that people who know their talent themes and use their strengths have a greater quality of life. They have higher well-being. We also know that they've got increased engagement. And one of the kind of cool pieces of research we did during the pandemic, during 2020, 2021, we were really looking at is we know as you increase engagement, you also increase resilience, right? So teams, organizations have more resilience when they have higher levels of engagement, right? So we know strengths is a big way of contributing to that, right? And so, so one of the big ways that you can lean into change, that you can lean into uncertainty, is to really understand your strengths. It gives you that sense of your own talents, what you do best. It's something that one of the powerful ways that strengths helps with change and uncertainty is your strengths are familiar. So in the landscape is unfamiliar, but it's who you are is familiar and your strengths are familiar. They're also controllable. And probably the biggest thing I think is that they give you back they restore your sense of competence. When you go back to, okay, this is who I am, this is what I do, right? This is what I contribute. It helps to restore that sense of competence, which gives you a place to stand as you're starting to deal with the uncertainty and the circumstances around you.
I love that. I think Steve asked a great question
Yeah.
when we think about that change is do people really resist change or do they more resist how it's imposed on them? And I think that's an interesting
Yeah.
dichotomy, right? Can you talk a little bit about that?
I mean, I think that's yeah, Steve, sounds funny. This is my take on it. I think, again, it's kind of the thing I said at the top of the session here. I think when we see change coming and we feel like a big sense of control over it, it feels very manageable to us, right? It's sometimes there's just change that happens that we don't have a say in and comes on us. I will tell you, one of the worst things you can do as a leader is surprise people. And sometimes when there's big changes in organizations, all of a sudden we just announce something, we surprise people, right? That creates a ripple effect for people, and we know that kind of lack of stability, that kind of lack of stability, creates additional stress that doesn't necessarily need to happen. So part of it is really helping people to be able to think through that, right?
Hmm.
And so I don't think that again, I think when people see that change coming, there's less resistance there. I think the resistance comes from, hey, I've got to restore my sense of control. I've got to restore my sense of my understanding of what's happening. Right? That's where the resistance is coming from. Right?
As we think of the four needs of followers from strengths-based leadership, and there's kind of a question to that here,
Yeah.
these four needs of followers and this idea of trust. I think oftentimes resistance comes from a lack of trust. They've been misled in the past or
Yeah.
burned or uh, you know uh, not given all the details. How important is that from a leadership perspective as well? And you've mentioned some of these, but as we think about that element of trust, of
Yeah.
leaders having the trust of those individuals to be able to deliver bad news, knowing
Right.
it's going to be done in a certain way. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so the four needs of followers came out of our strengths-based leadership stuff. The four needs of followers are compassion, hope, stability, and trust, right?
Trust. Hmm.
And so just to make sure everybody's in the same conversation, right? So yeah, I think trust is huge, right? And I think it's one of those things where, particularly for people in these kind of parts of changes or times of changes that people have that sense like, hey, is this somebody that I feel like I can rely on? If there's been unpredictable behavior in the past, or if people feel like they're surprised by change, it's harder for people, right? So I also think that having a leader, I think the compassion piece is super important. Is as you go through times of change, are you somebody that understands, hey, the impact that this is going to have and the emotional impact that along with it? It's not, sometimes you see leaders that they communicate change, but they don't address any of the emotional impacts that go along with change. And I think that's a mistake, you
Hmm.
know? So people need to have that sense. It's like, hey, we know the change, we know the impact that this is going to have, and the impact is not just in the way we work; it's also an impact in our sense of self as we go through that. That makes
Dean,
sense.
I have, oh, for sure. Yeah, I love
Yeah,
that. I have a ranger, activator, and adaptability all in my top 10. I think I'm
yeah.
pretty good at change. Are there a certain set of strengths that make us good at it versus maybe some that aren't? Can you talk a little bit about that?
I mean, my opinion about that is, so here I'm about to lay one of my opinions on you.
I like them. I like them.
I just don't think I know that there's people that say, "Hey, I have this theme or that theme, and that's going to make me good at change or like that," right? And again, I think when we're talking about real change versus variety, I want to make sure that distinction is clear. When we're talking about the real change that impacts people, I don't know that there's themes that are better at that. Right. I think that there are themes that roll with it, but I think it can be as hard to deal with change for somebody who's got adaptability or activate or some of those other themes that seem like they're positively disposed to change. I have a very close friend right now who's going through a divorce, right? He's super high in adaptability. But the emotional impact of it is huge for him. And so it's not just because you've got a certain theme doesn't it make you better disposed to do that. I don't think that there's better strengths at handling change. I think that there's better people at handling change. I think it's more about as you go through change, it's things like do you know and you understand and are aware of your own talent themes? Do you have good self-awareness as a human being? Right. I think when you're grounded in yourself and you're not dislocated from who you are, I think that makes you better at dealing with things like change. I think if you've taken the time to develop your talent themes into strengths, I think that makes a huge difference. It's not just I know what my talents are, but have I invested in them? Am I focusing on them? Am I turning them into strengths that I can use? Because that leads then, I think, to things like strategies where you can say, hey, I'm anchored in my strengths. I've got strategies that help me deal effectively with stuff. And so that if I know kind of what those personal strengths-based strategies are, that helps me deal more effectively and productively with the stress and the uncertainty that comes with change, right? I think also that great self-awareness really helps. I think in times of duress, change creates a huge amount of duress, a huge amount of stress for people, right? And when we're under pressure, I think it's harder to manage the expression of our themes and to regulate our themes. Right. So I think if we think about one of the things that helps us is the more we've taken the time to understand our own talents and strengths, the more we've developed talents into legitimate strengths that we use, the better our self-awareness is going to be. So when change happens and we're under pressure, we're better at being able to express our talents and strengths in really healthy ways and also to regulate them so they don't get all over everybody. Right. So I think that's really helpful.
I was kind of making fun of myself in that example. I've
Yeah.
actually said that in the past, and yet there's
Yeah.
been moments where I haven't been in the right position, or I've had
Right.
repeated stressful situations happening one on top of the other.
Yeah.
And the answer wasn't necessarily, well, just lean into it harder with your strengths, right? Can you talk a little bit about that arena? Because I think there was a lot of
Yeah.
people there right now, Dean, where it's been one hit after another,
Yeah.
and maybe just leaning in isn't the right answer. Can you talk
Yeah.
about maybe some strategies there?
Yeah. There's a difference between, yeah, this is really good. There's a difference between leaning into your strengths and just applying more pressure, right? Or just applying more force, right? So, I'm going to say a funny thing. I think this feels a little, hopefully it feels intuitive to people, but talented people actually like pressure. Right. So talented people actually like that moment where preparation meets opportunity, right? Where it's like, hey, I've been training for this. Okay, it's the pressure performance. I'm up to bat. Give me the ball, coach, whatever. I'm mixing my sports analogies, but you get the point, right? Like there's that moment where it's like, hey, I've trained for this. I know I got the talent for this. Watch what I can do. So talented people actually like a little bit of pressure, right? They like that moment where they can say, hey, man, I am going to show you now, right? But when you're in the wrong job or you're in the wrong situation where your talents are not a fit for the opportunity, that's when it's pressure really becomes stress for people, right? Because it's not, hey, watch what we can do. It's like, hey, what I've got, it doesn't feel relevant here. Or I can press myself as much as possible, but my talents, the talents and the things I can do aren't necessarily going to contribute here. Or you're going to ask me to do things that I don't really have talent, so I got to reach down and pull up all the reserves of what I got. It may not be enough, right? And I think that's where it's hard for people. So it's trying to figure out, hey, how do I connect what I know I can do and what I'm good at? How do I connect those things to the moment, right? And to be able to figure what that is. We do, sometimes this is where it's hard, sometimes where you're in the middle of a company-wide reorganization. you know, or all of a sudden we've decided, hey, we're going to have these people do this thing, right? And you got to figure out like, okay, hey, how am I going to connect with that? How do what I've got to give and my talents have to connect with that and be useful in that particular situation?
Dean, a comment from the chat room. They said nobody outside the U.S. probably got any of those sports metaphors. It's okay. Even in the U.S., we may
I
not have
didn't.
gotten those.
Yeah, right. Exactly. I
Those
use
sports.
I use a lot of sports analogies. I know nothing about sports.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's Dean. When we think about coaching for a
Sorry about that.
second, no, in the context of this, oftentimes I know when I'm under the
Yeah.
greatest amount of stress, and let me use the term stress as
Yeah.
you just
Yeah. Yeah.
go getting someone else involved in this conversation, still thinking about my strengths and navigating through these changes has been super helpful. Can you talk about the role of coaching, or we may have certified coaches listening to this, how you would encourage them in helping people navigate these waters?
Yeah, I think it's the same, some of the same things we talked about before, but I think as a coach, you're outside of the situation, right? So one is that one of the great things you can do is help people to anticipate change. I don't know if you've had this experience, but I've certainly had this experience coaching people that I can hear, hey, change is coming. They start to tell me about what's going on. I can hear change is coming, and helping them anticipate that change is really useful. I think also a big piece of that coaches can do is help people then get re-grounded in who they are and what their talents are and what their contributions are. It is not to be underestimated the power of coaching to help really get people grounded again in who are you, what do you contribute, what are your talents, what is, so that they've got that. I also think that sometimes, and I think this is a mistake sometimes in our coaching community, is I think coaches sometimes are focused a ton on helping people understand their talent themes and build self-awareness. I think that's good, but I think where coaching really makes a difference is helping people apply their talents and strengths in meaningful ways in their work and in their life, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so one of the biggest things I think strengths coaches do is help people come up with those strategies for applying their strengths. When you're somebody, I think it's part of being a professional, right? Is that you can walk in the door and say, this is how I work, and this is how to set me up for success, right? And when you know your own talents and strengths, you're better equipped to be able to articulate that. You can walk in the door and say, hey, this is what I do, right? And particularly in times of change, to be able to be clear headed about that, to be able to say, hey, these are my strategies. So as a coach, the work you do with a client to be able to say, hey, let's not just help you understand your talents and strengths, develop your self-awareness. I'm not deprecating that in any way. That's useful. But I don't think the job ends there, right? The job really starts once we can say, yep, I know who I am. I get it. I love myself. I appreciate myself. Now let's talk about how I'm going to apply this in the world in meaningful ways. And what are the strategies I'm going to use? And how am I going to make sure I'm set up for success? I'll tell you one thing. One of the things we do with new associates, new employees at Gallup in their first 6 months is part of the thing we say to them is, hey, your job, one of your key jobs when you join Gallup is we want you to really, in a really meaningful way, understand your own talents and strengths, and then go train everybody. So you got to go be out there training your team and training your manager, right? Here's who I am. This is how I work. This is how I think about things, right? This is the stuff I lean into. And the more great self-awareness you've got, the better equipped you're going to be to train people. But if you don't do that job at training people, then you're going to be in trouble, right? Because nobody's going to know it. So, and strengths coaches helping people to be able to do that. So they start to condition their environment around that really makes a difference.
That's great. I always appreciate that. And that's not just, by the way, that just doesn't happen for the first 6 months. We spend a lot of time when changes is happening of working with each other, coaching each other around that. I find it sometimes just having my problems not be my coach's problems are great insight into getting clear feedback on that, right? We're not in this together. You can see certain things that I can't see because I'm buried in them. And I always appreciate that feedback
Yeah.
from coaches as well. Dean, thanks for taking the time today. 30 minutes just flies by when we're together, but thanks for taking the time today to be here. I appreciate it. Thanks for coming out.
Yeah, you're welcome. My
Want to
pleasure.
we want to remind everyone that we're moving these LinkedIn Lives are now available on our Clifton Strengths podcast. So if you haven't subscribed to that, head out to your favorite podcast player, search the Clifton Strengths podcast. I know, super original, the Clifton Strengths podcast. You can find us out there, subscribe to that, and we'd love to have you join us in the journey as we move along there as well. Thanks for coming out today. Make sure you're subscribed to the Clifton Strengths page on LinkedIn while you're there. Take care. And with that, we'll say goodbye, everybody.